I'm the president of Iowa Atheists and Freethinkers. I live here in Des Moines with my 2 children. One of them is right here in the front row. And I'm a big advocate of separation of church and state. I think without separation of church and state, you don't have a democracy. That's one of the key founding tenets of the United States, is that the power of the government isn't invested in a deity, it's invested in the people. And that's a unique thing in history. So with that being said, this panel is very important to me. I've done a lot of work on this, and I'm happy to host these 3 speakers here. I'm going to ask them about your questions, and depending on time, I'm going to open it up for questions from the floor. I'm going to have you go ahead and go down the line and introduce yourself, give 30 seconds about yourself, and then we'll go into the questions. So go ahead and start.
Yeah, I'm Mortimer Adramelech. I'm a minister of Satan for the Satanic Temple. I've been involved in leading and writing rituals here in Iowa for the past 5 years or so. You might be familiar with my work if you saw the holiday display up at the Iowa State Capitol. I was the artist for that, although it was a group effort, our group put together. I've also been working on maintaining plurality for all religions in the public forum, to have equal access to public forum.
I'm Tyler Owen. I'm the president of the Humanists of Linn County. Previously president of Tri-State Humanists down in Burlington, Iowa. This is my 2nd year with Humanists of Linn County, and we focus on trying to create a inclusive community for non-believers and secular individuals in Eastern Iowa. Yeah, I'm happy to be here.
My name is Lee Prince. I am a husband and father of 4, and I am a lawyer by training. I work in a local insurance company in government relations. And I'm also a lay minister in the local congregation. I serve in our bishopric, working with youth and adults, but mostly youth.
Excellent, excellent. So just so everyone's clear, atheist, Satanist, humanist, LDS.
That's right.
Fair?
Jesus Christ, Latter-day Saints. I almost got there.
Okay. All right, so I'm going to go with my first question, and I'm going to start with you, Mortimer, and go down, and then I'll kind of shake it up so everybody goes first. The first question is, what does the separation of church and state mean to you?
Well, we could talk about the Establishment Clause. A lot of people seem to misunderstand that religion can't be in any public forum. Really, it just means that no religion can receive preference over another, or lack of belief, atheism, or any other belief system should have equal access to the public forum, or else it is against the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment and unconstitutional.
Okay.
Yeah, for me as a humanist, I think the easiest way to put it is I'm concerned about when the government puts their thumb on the scale in the balance of representation for different religions. And there's a lot of gray area there, because oftentimes the existence of a majority religion in a society does not necessarily mean that they're imposing those views on other people, but sometimes that can be the case, and courts go to decide those issues. So for me, it's just about trying to identify where that line is. Is it their undue pressure being put on the people by the government, or is it just a matter of the demographic of that area?
I'm going to steal my answer from Jesus in the New Testament. When he was in Judea, there was a lot of pressure because folks thought that the person who was going to fill the role of Messiah would be kind of a political liberator and someone who freed them from Roman oppression. And he said, render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. And so for me, the separation of church and state is really about understanding when we need to be separate and what's appropriate, but also understanding when it's appropriate to partner together and to benefit from the perspectives that religious folks can bring to the operation of government.
So staying with you, so why do you think that is so important to you in your particular organization?
Some of it's been expressed here today, but I think that it's probably centered in the belief that I have that, it's very hard and probably inappropriate and detrimental to compartmentalize our lives to the extent that we're holistic beings, and who we are, whether that is reference point of our religious persuasion or our cultural heritage, really influences every aspect of our lives. And so to try and unnecessarily or artificially separate out aspects of who I am from the different arenas of my life, I find that to be not productive. And I think it makes my participation in different spheres kind of less helpful to those spheres.
So you would say it's probably not only not good or beneficial for society, but probably impossible to completely separate your religious views or faith from other aspects of your life, whatever it may be.
Absolutely. I mean, I show up in a lot of different arenas in my community, and for me to not show up fully myself in those arenas, I think wouldn't be as big a benefit to me or those arenas as it is when I show up as a fully participating religious person.
So Tyler, you're with the Humanists of Linn County. Why do you think separation of church and state is so important for the Humanists?
Well, I mean, I think going back to my previous statements about putting pressure on the scales, right? I mean, there is a difficulty, I think, when people are faced with making decisions, right, in any position, whether that be in a court case or as an employer. You have to be true to your personal beliefs, but at the same time, you have to respect the law of the land that may be from a pluralistic society that doesn't share your beliefs. And so there are times where you may be compelled to go against your personal belief because it's against the law. I mean, if you believe that it's, you should have the right to go murder someone that doesn't believe in your religion, that's not going to fly, right? So I mean, there are absolute issues where your religious belief, even if it's very earnestly held, will be violated. That's just the nature of living in a society where we all together get to decide what is and is not allowed, right? So that's where I think there is not this absolute protection of religious belief, and I think most of us would agree with that when presented with those extremes.
So for you, it sounds like having separation of church and state means neither one will be perfectly unencroached upon by the other.
Absolutely. I'm going to have to make sacrifices in terms of what I believe to exist in a pluralistic society, and so will everyone else.
Okay. Same question to you, Mortimer. Go ahead.
I suppose from the Satanist perspective, it's kind of been difficult here in Iowa lately. We've had legislation proposed against us specifically to ban our religion from being in the public forum. We've been persecuted in various ways in press statements from elected officials. I won't name names, but really just existing in public has become a challenge for many people who are part of my faith here in Iowa today.
So staying on that topic, there was a piece of legislation that didn't make it out of the funnel, that didn't make it out of committee, but it was a piece of legislation in the state of Iowa that did explicitly ban the practice, acknowledgement, or even wearing symbols of the Satanic Temple of Iowa. Has that, do you feel like that has been a direct threat to the separation of church and state for you?
Well, luckily it didn't pass, but it clearly would have, although I don't imagine that any court would hold it up. Just trying to set that precedent that one faith has preferential treatment over another, or to be disparaged in law is an enormous threat to the separation of church and state, in my opinion.
Very good. So Tyler, can you think of an example where the state has encroached on religion?
On religion? That's a good question. I mean, I think there are plenty of historical examples where, for example, we've had tests of office for what faith you needed to be in order to hold public office. I mean, most of those have been shot down. I mean, there are still, I believe there's still some laws on the books that have just been superseded, but they've not been repealed or anything. So I mean, that historically is a problem, and I think that it's certainly lesser today, but I think there's still a lot of implicit bias and a lot of unfair treatment that goes for all different avenues of religious belief.
Lee, same question, other way. Can you think of an example where religion has encroached on the state?
an example where religion has encroached on,
Onto the state, say there's been more religious law, or a law would only stand because it's based on a religious text, for example, being applied into a secular state.
actually, on top of my head, I can't, but I think that a larger point related to the question is just that, the form of government that we have is meant to, it's a democracy where kind of whoever's in the majority gets to make the rules. And so the whole point of a Bill of Rights and those kind of things is to make sure that, even though that's the case, that minorities have certain rights protected. And so for me, I've experienced this question from two kind of different perspectives that are related. One, being the member of a minority religion growing up in the South, I've experienced kind of what it feels like when the predominant denomination of the area starts to get more and more political power and push the envelope on the Establishment Clause. But also just as a religious person in general, kind of in community with other religious people, can understand the need to make sure that the Establishment Clause doesn't go overboard and keep, as Elder Morgan expressed earlier, keep me from being able to express my religious self in public life.
I have a follow-up, and I want to give Mortimer a chance to weigh in on that question. Either way, can you think of an example where religion has encroached on the state, or the state has encroached on a religion?
Equal access to government buildings definitely comes up in my mind. I spoke at a school board meeting in Moline, Illinois earlier this year, where there was a Good News Club, a Christian after-school club, and we also had after-school Satan Club in the same building. And our club, it focused on student-directed learning, science, and it doesn't really evangelize or tell children about Satanism, but our club was forced off campus and the Good News Club remained. Luckily, the school board did reverse that decision after a lot of outcry from Satanists and secular activists.
Do you think that would hold up in a court if the Satanists had sued?
I mean, it seems like a pretty clear example of different second-class citizenship being forced off campus when an equivalent club of a different faith was not.
So, related to that, and you mentioned the separation clause, Lee, as well, do you think that and this is for all three of you, anybody want to chime in, the separation of church and state, religious tests, et cetera, are those a higher, I would say, right or protection than, say, freedom of speech, press, assembly, et cetera? Would you say the freedom of religion is more important than the other rights enshrined in the Constitution?
Well, I think that it in a large sense, it encompasses the other First Amendment rights, right? And to be clear, there's not a separation clause, but those
What's
are
interpreted as such.
Sure,
yes.
sure. There's an establishment clause and a free exercise clause, and I think that at the very least, it's co-equal with those other First Amendment rights of being able to assemble with the people that we want to and express ourselves. I think it's critical, like we've talked about in the plural society, to be able to do that. One thing I do want to point out though is the cases and the hypotheticals that kind of come to the forefront are the ones that are really on the margins, or that are in those spaces where there's a gray area. But I think to a large extent, religious folks and irreligious folks, or humanists or secularists, kind of agree and have come to a stasis on what's appropriate and what's not. There's always going to be spaces where it's not clear and we fight at the margins, but to a large extent, I think everyone understands the value of those rights as they've been expressed and interpreted in the Constitution through the Supreme Court.
Tyler, do you want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the discussion around our rights is important because we recognize here in the United States that the Constitution is a living document, and not just in the sense that it can be amended, but in that it's constantly being reinterpreted, right? So the way that the law is applied depends on the generation or the individuals who are currently enforcing enforcing the law and interpreting the law. So in an instance like was previously mentioned, where a coach was proselytizing, praying, preaching with his members of his team in his capacity as a coach for the school at the event, today that's been interpreted as being permissible. And I would personally disagree with that as it being appropriate, and I guess as part of that general discussion, like you mentioned with the gray area, it was a 5-4 decision. I think there may become a time where our society reinterprets that and says that that's not permissible, and I think that should be the case. But you know, we live in a society where we all have to come to some kind of common agreement on these things. So, you know, I think there are going to be plenty of disagreements on where that line is drawn, but I think that constant discussion and respectful discussion is what should be happening.
So on that case, Mortimer, how would you have preferred the Supreme Court rule on that case?
Well, it's kind of a tricky one. I suppose there is the possibility that members of other faiths could lead service. It seems tricky because that's one coach with one religious perspective administering religious services to a team. I'm actually not sure where I would stand on the best way for that to be practiced or put into play.
Okay. So I'll weigh in a little bit here and say, I know not just my organization, but others that I'm sure we're all familiar with, like the Freedom from Religion Foundation or the ACLU, have weighed in on these cases, and I think they tend to be obviously on the more on the secular side. But I want to pose this to Lee, and everyone else can comment. In this situation, say the coach, or it could be a community leader or something like that, that is an agent of the state leading a prayer. Do you think a state can be truly separate and equitable to all faiths if there's an agent of a particular faith working as an agent of the state proselytizing?
So let me just qualify my comments with, my opinion as a constitutional scholar is like very close to worthless.
You're on the panel, so I'm asking you.
So I would say, let me answer the question by how I would approach that as a person who coaches teams and as a person whose faith is very important, and personally someone who is excited about proselytizing. I have no problem sharing my faith with others, inviting others to become part of things that I think are beneficial, such as prayer. For me personally, I think there's other more appropriate arenas to do that, more normal and natural, to quote the phrase that was used earlier, ways to share my faith with others and to be an example. So I would probably personally tend to be a little bit sensitive to the feelings of others who might not enjoy that personally, but I also would have no problem with someone else doing that and being tolerant of them doing that, even if I might not want to participate. So, sorry I can't be more helpful as a legal scholar. I'll trust the majority of the Supreme Court and what they said, but yeah, I think personally, look, I think I think it was talked about, the last speaker kind of showed different ways that there can be advocacy, that there can be religion in that particular instance in higher education. And I think we tend to rush headlong into how can I make policy, how can I legislate, how can I get the rules to be the way I want them to, when I think really moving the needle on improving human lives comes at a very granular kind of one-on-one type setting, right? How can I help my neighbor? How can I share my beliefs with someone who is close to me? Maybe at the very moment, how can I serve in a local community setting? I think those things tend to achieve the objectives that we're trying to achieve a lot more than policy. Not that there's not a place for fighting for policy and public policy, but for me personally, that's where I like to spend my energy.
So I've heard it said in regards to this case, and similar to what you're saying as a coach, imagine that we had, instead of 3 panelists, we had 13 or 30, and everybody wants to get their 30 seconds in to do their prayer or whatever they want to do. That's untenable, right? Just physically we couldn't do that. So would you think it would be better off, and I'm going to pose this to you, Tyler, would it be better off if we had more carve-outs for stuff like that, like breakout sessions or some kind of codified method that this is your practice time or before school time, and then this is where it's okay to proselytize, and this is where it's not. Do you think that would be better to carve it out in our society?
I think those carve-outs already exist. I mean, I think the public square, we've used that term many, many times through multiple speakers here, and I think there's a, I am not a legal scholar, so I can't speak with full authority on this, but there are public spaces where your right to speak what you believe is completely protected. And the discussion isn't necessarily over that, it's over what qualifies as a public place or a public position, right? Are you acting as an employee of the state, an agent of the state? Are you acting as a private citizen? Those are where the lines are being drawn. And so I think those carve-outs already exist. Your personal beliefs and your right to state those are fully protected. I absolutely support that. I think it's really more of a question of the defining what qualifies as a public space, what qualifies as being a private citizen versus an agent of the state. So I think that's where the difficulty lies, and I think things get oversimplified and misconstrued, and that gives people a misunderstanding of what the actual issue is. So I think a lot of that also stems from historical Christian or majority belief privilege, and I think sometimes the challenge or removal of those privileges can be seen as an attack on that specific religion, when all it is really doing is leveling the playing field, making all religions equal. And so I think there's a misunderstanding, and rightfully so, when you hold those beliefs very deeply, I can understand that response. I absolutely do. I can empathize, right? But you have to put yourself in someone else's shoes and imagine what their reaction might be to being in an opposite or similar situation. So I think there's just a disconnect, and events like this, where multiple different beliefs are being presented and shared, is a greater way to build that empathy and understanding so that we don't have those misunderstandings.
Any comments on that one before I ask Linn a question?
So the question would be about sports specifically?
Do you think there should be more carve-outs? And then I'll just go to the next one because it's related.
Well, I just don't think it needs to we don't need to have religious services during school practices, sports. It just doesn't need to happen. Kind of just takes away the focus on getting together for your common purpose if you're just going to start fighting over religious beliefs.
So the point taken on that, but that rolls into things like religious exemptions, like exemptions for vaccines, or if you want specific holidays off, for days you couldn't work, things like that. Do you think things like those erode the separation of church and state, or are they good and necessary for a functional pluralistic society?
Well, some religions already have their holidays off and others don't, so I do understand why that would be a separation of church and state issue if, for instance, you can't get your major holidays off with your family, but all of your classmates can. That does come across as unequal in my thoughts. As for vaccines,
Just one example of it.
I just don't understand how that's a religious issue, but maybe that's just me.
Any thoughts on that, Lee?
I tend to think that, there's appropriate carve-outs and space for people to express themselves. I think higher education tends to be like the battleground that gets chosen for a lot of these things, and I'm comfortable with the purpose of school being reading, writing, arithmetic, and those kinds of things. So yeah, I think that you're always going to have a tension between what's practically tenable as far as what time and space will allow, and giving everyone equal voice. That's going to be the case in many arenas. So I think to the extent that it makes sense to a normal person, that sure, carve-outs are acceptable, and the more we can level the playing field and hear from different voices. I think the David Brooks quote was really encapsulating of what we're trying to accomplish and just how hard it is. We all come from many, many different backgrounds, and any other place where they have advanced democracy, they're largely culturally homogenous, and we are not. And So that creates its own challenges, and, I think we've done a noble job of tackling them with some, notable failures, but I think, just like people can change and people can improve and repent, institutions can do the same, and I think that that's the trajectory we're on.
Well, let's talk about that real quick. What would you say are some of the failures of that happening in the United States?
Well, obviously, slavery is the one that comes to mind, concentration camps during World War II, equal rights, women's suffrage. There's some big ones that I think we can all agree on. And so, I think it's important. I think that the framers were very wise to understand that really, when you have a government, then power is going to coalesce around certain things, and to try and really separate that out so that the rights of minorities can be protected, while at the same time getting stuff done. Right? In democracy, you want to get stuff done, but you want to get stuff done in a way that doesn't trample on folks' rights. So I think the more we can go back to principles-based evaluation of the different problems, I think the safer we'll be.
So that gets me to another question I had. I'm going to pose it to Tyler first, because a lot of these things that we're talking about when we talk about holidays, vaccines, dietary restrictions, etc., oftentimes in legislation, the words used are sincerely held belief. If you have a sincerely held belief, it's a religious belief, then you qualify for some kind of exemption. So my question to everybody on the panel is, what is a sincerely held belief, and how do we tell how sincerely it's held that it qualifies?
I think there's often an implicit following to sincerely held belief that doesn't harm anyone, and I think that's where a lot of the really easy cases are determined, where it's like, okay, yeah, you have a sincerely held belief that doesn't harm anybody else. Obviously, that should be protected. It's where we determine where the harm lies, right? And granted, even things that I feel strongly about that I disagree with our federal government and state government's position on, I have to admit that the harm is pretty small. But it's still important to defend things that you disagree with morally, that contradict the way you choose to live your life. And so for something like, prayers before city council meetings, right? That is something that it takes up time, and that takes up my tax dollars. Now, how much of my tax dollars? Probably pennies, right? If that. But it's still a harm that's spread across a great number of people. If we imagine that the majority of religion in the United States was the Satanic Temple, and every city council meeting led with a Satanic Temple prayer, or at least the vast majority of them, I think there'd be a pretty huge outcry from Christians saying that this is a waste of taxpayer money. I think that's just all that we're doing when we're trying to oppose those sort of things.
So before I go on one, would you say it doesn't matter if it's sincerely held or not? It's more about...
I think the implicit part that doesn't cause harm is what matters.
So same question to you, how do you tell what a sincerely held belief is and how sincere it is?
Well, I suppose with the Satanic Temple, it's very easy. We have the 7 tenets that is our guiding stone, our religious philosophy, our belief system. Since we recently got RFRA, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, signed in Iowa, as per the Hobby Lobby case, it should be our religious right as Satanists to avoid certain restrictions if we seek an abortion during the first trimester, such as waiting periods, unscientific information given, and I firmly believe that those Satanists who perform satanic ritual abortions should have those waiting restrictions lifted as a religious exemption.
So I think that's an example of a sincerely held belief. Lee, would you say that would qualify him for an exemption to a current, say, abortion ban?
Well, I'll give the legalistic answer, which is, in law school, they wrestle all the time with these kind of standards that are nebulous that yet then the case law fleshes out. Like, the famous one is what's a reasonably prudent person. A lot of cases where people sue each other get decided on, what would a reasonably prudent person do? And so, that's pretty hard to encapsulate in just a few sentences. And so there's a whole body of cases that.
But it's a due process. And
that's right. So
process that you do, yeah.
Yeah. So what's a sincerely held belief is kind of a similar type standard, and it's fleshed out. I mean, I think the time you spend in behalf of your cause, there's a whole host of context type factors, but I'll take Mortimer at his word that that's a sincerely held belief, and
The right to bodily autonomy specifically, and
Sure.
Science.
yeah, and really, and isn't that what these religious rights are getting at? The things that are core to you as a person and that are important to you as a person, with the caveat that they don't inflict harm on someone else, you should be respected, and then you should be able to live your life with that kind of autonomy that's inside of you and that belief without, being fettered by the state.
Very good. Anything else to add, Heather, before I move on? No? Okay. So we're running low on time. I want to make sure I have time for questions. So how many people have questions before I go on to the next question? One? Okay, we can get you in again. I'll continue then. The whole room raised their hand and I stop. If church and state were melded into one, say, like a theocracy, within the Constitution of, say, the state of Iowa, it says we find all of our rights come from the Satanic Temple or the LDS church or whatever. Do you think your organization could or would still exist? And don't just say it's the Satanic Temple, say any really theocracy were enshrined, would your organization exist and could it exist?
Is that directed at me?
First, yeah.
Yeah, we provide religious services and programs, like we have rituals. We might not be so gung-ho about pluralism if, our religious beliefs are already being forced down each other people's throats, but we would still exist. We would just have different priorities, I'm sure.
Okay.
I think if the Satanic Temple was the majority religion and I was, yes, I believe so, because I think our tenets align very similarly with the Satanic Temple. I think if a religion were an established part of our government that was openly hostile towards my beliefs, I think that there's a question of whether my group would exist officially or unofficially. And unofficially, absolutely, we would still exist. I think that would be, anyone here would say that, right? That you would not give up your religion just because the state says you can't, participate in that. But I do think it would be very difficult to exist in a society where that was the case.
And so the same question to you, if the Satanic Temple of Iowa was the founding document of Iowa, do you think the LDS Church would exist?
I don't know enough about how gracious and tolerant the Satanic Temple of Iowa is. I would hope that it would still exist, but I'll just say on a broader pattern of any particular faith or way of thinking gaining power usually doesn't bode well for minorities, and so I think that's why it's very important that we continue to have pluralistic dialogue, pluralistic ideas, being respectful within bounds of other folks' beliefs. So my own faith's personal experience has been one of not super recent, but persecution even within the United States, and being forced to kind of flee the United States and go outside of the Utah, which at the time wasn't part of the United States. So even in a democratic society, sometimes I think there's threats to being able to, live your religion the way you want to. So I would be extremely suspect of any one faith getting control of earth. That sounds like anathema to me.
Well, I asked that specifically because we're talking about church-state separation, and you kind of know in the original colonies what happened to minority religions, like in Maryland. You weren't Catholic in some of these, or if you were Catholic, you could not hold office. You were not saved. You did not get afforded the same privileges and rights, and that's one of the reasons we can agree that the founders of the United States put that separation, that the establishment clause in there, because they saw that as ruining these states. Utah is another good example of that. They're kind of the monotheist state being able to dictate who gets to be a citizen. So separation of church and state makes a lot of sense there. But having said that, keeping church and state separate and knowing that we have nonprofit organizations, non-government entities, and just groups, in your view, and I'll start with you, should churches be taxed? And should they be taxed in the same way or differently than a nonprofit group like Iowa Atheists and Freethinkers or Goodwill or the Red Cross?
No, I don't think so. I think that the First Amendment and the protections that are afforded there to not just religion, but our ability to do good in the world, should be protected from being taxed, just like any 501c3 or other kind of tax-exempt organization that qualifies under whatever the IRS has said, you have to do in order to not have to pay taxes. I think.
So just real quick, so you think your church should file that or be treated that way or differently?
I do not think my church should pay taxes to the government outside of the taxes that I already pay.
And I mean, just to tie it to your response before I move on, you mentioned the other 501c3s. You think they should be treated like 501c3s, not taxed, and
In that respect, yeah. I mean, I think that the work, when we saw a little bit of it on display today, the humanitarian work, and the humanitarian work is great, and it's an important part of what we do. But to be frank, what we're really trying to do is change people from the inside, and sometimes that requires giving them food or helping them find fresh water. But largely, it involves beliefs and changing who we are and how we act. And so, to me, that mission is critical, and it takes a lot of resources. And I'm very comfortable with the status quo, but I'm also comfortable for other, like organizations to qualify under those same exemptions.
And so Tyler, carrying on from that, you're the president of Humanists of Linn County, a 501c3, correct? What is your view on how your organization is treated versus church?
I think we're very careful to operate within the intent behind those nonprofit protections and ensure that we're not endorsing candidates or taking very specifically prevented actions on part of that organization. So that we pay very close attention to, and I think there are a lot of churches who don't, and they openly flaunt the law in many cases. And I do believe that there are instances where the spirit of that law is being violated and is not being upheld. But do I think that that's a particularly worthwhile effort to try and go after those institutions? Probably not. I think there are other more worthwhile legislative issues that we could be focusing on. But I do think that it is important to note that there are many churches who openly flaunt the restrictions placed on those organizations.
And Mortimer, you're a part of the Satanic Temple of Iowa. That is not a 501c3. That is a church, correct?
We are a church, yeah.
Okay. So do you think that your organization should be treated the same way as the Humanists or Iowa Atheists and Freethinkers? And just in case my meaning isn't clear here, nonprofits like IAF and other 501c3s do have to disclose expenditures. They're subject to FOIA requests and things like that. Churches are not. That's one of the things I'm going for.
I would almost reverse the question. I think that atheist groups should be considered religious groups and be treated exactly the same.
I disagree, but I'm curious on that. I wasn't planning on that.
Well, then you can defend your rights more with the Constitution more easily, I would say.
Okay, that's what I thought you were going to say. So if someone were, if Lee wanted to give IAF a bunch of money, I don't have to tell anybody what I'm doing with it and just go and buy a big banner ad that says, "Lee loves atheists." Is that what you're saying that she gets to do?
If the churches can do it, why not?
Okay.
I mean, I'm not one to write the laws, but I do think they should be applied equally, however they're decided.
So one more thing on that. What would disqualify an organization from being a church under that description?
And openly endorsing candidates would be one thing.
So if I wanted to have my soccer team become a church, I could, because we're not endorsing candidates. I think you open a can of worms when you reverse the questions, whatever.
Right, well, I mean, atheism is about I'm a Satanist. I'm not going to speak for you, but I would assume that it's about your religious worldview, even though it's non-religion.
Any comments, Linn, before I go to the audience question?
No, I mean, I'll agree in spirit that, like, I think all organizations should trend towards transparency and openness. I think that's healthy and good for everyone. But as far as wading into the specifics of the tax code and requirements, I don't really have an opinion beyond just that, churches should continue to enjoy their tax exempt status.
All right. So we have one question out in the audience before we wrap up. Any others? Two? Okay. Any more microphones coming? This is my daughter, Olivia. Excellent baton twirler.
My question's for Tyler. So I am a nurse manager during the height of the pandemic of 60 nurses that I managed. And I work for the state of Iowa. And at the height of the pandemic, there was a point that there were no ICU beds, and so patients were dying with us on our unit when we normally would be sent into ICU. I mean, it was really terrible, super terrible. And there was so much moral distress on our team. And I felt at a certain point to offer our team the opportunity to start our shifts with a prayer in the break room, non-denominational prayer. And I just offered it for a few days, and there were no takers, so I stopped doing it. And I never wanted to ask anybody how they felt. Like, I didn't want to push it at all. So I'm wondering from your perspective, if you were one of my employees, how you would have felt with that offer.
That's a really complex question, and I think there's many factors that you have to take into consideration. If I were a subordinate employee of you, I would have felt pressure of some kind of retaliation if I would not participate. Or you would have at least, maybe not even consciously, but you would have looked at me differently, right? And I think that's important to understand when we think about these situations where maybe there's a gray area in terms of the law and what would be allowed or not allowed. I like to try and take just the most empathetic approach that you can. If you were in their shoes, how would you feel if someone asked you to participate in a prayer of their religion that you didn't belong to, right? Now, I mean, that's never going to be something that, except for extreme cases where you can draw an exact line from, the person opting out of that experience and then later being retaliated against, which is very difficult to do in the law. Except for those extreme cases, it really just does come down to basic human decency. Like, what would you want someone to do for you, right? Like, maybe you ask, outside of the workplace, like, how are you doing? Like, what are you doing to cope with this situation? Like, are you a part of any faith or non-faith? Like, could I attend with you or, experience what you're experiencing to help you through, because I'm having difficulty as well. Just ask people what their perspective is first, right? Rather than try to assume that they share the same beliefs you do or that they would be comfortable participating in something that you're proposing.
Anybody else want to weigh in on that? Before we go to Okay.
My question is for our moderator.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah. So, you are here and you've been a witness for a couple of years. And I know that for you, conditions in our state and in our nation aren't where you'd like them to be in terms of separation of church and state. And yet you're still willing to stand in a group of people who are generally religious. And so I was wondering if you could tell us why religious freedom is still important to you.
Well, I think without religious freedom, people like me couldn't exist, really. That's kind of the baseline of it. To quote Christopher Hitchens, if I could, we remember what religion did when it had all the power. It came to our doorstep with a spear. Now it comes to us with the hat in hand and smiles and ties, and that's preferable than the spears. But I mean, it's fundamentally that is why I think it's important, because if less people believe in religious freedom, whether it be interdenominationally, interreligiously, or accepting non-believers, then there's room for progress. If groups like this and organizations like this and events like this don't exist, then we do have the spears again, because there's no other voice telling them not to use them. And that's my biggest concern. And so as an atheist, I go down the list as a veteran, as a minority, as a homeowner, as a father, as an atheist. This state not looking too hot for me and the future of my kids. But if I don't do anything, I don't want to look at her in 15 years and say, yeah, I'd rather play Xbox than go out in front of people and share my ideas, because this is how ideas change, not staying home playing Xbox.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, well, it's been Lee, Tyler, and Mortimer. Thank you so much for your time. Yeah.